Here's a spoiler. This video gets absolutely nowhere in terms of solving a core issue. Sure, I may propose plenty of somewhat decent ideas for fixing the issue, but all of them resulted in me realizing that none of them are realistically achievable because human nature. But first, let's address the people with atrocious attention spans. Before any of you bozos leave, let me just make a compelling statement as to why the educational system has objectively gone to shit. Most of Gen Alpha is illiterate. That should be all the convincing you need to stick around. Also, you probably suffered at the hands of the educational system, so knowing all of its flaws can maybe give you some closure. Anyways, just a quick briefing on how best to watch this lengthy video essay. Don't. Just treat it as a podcast or an audiobook where I have a schizophrenic episode and argue with myself. It's a topic where I don't know what I should even draw, so I'll just use this drawing of a school on fire for the entire scene, because it's quite fitting for the theme of this video. Now, I do realize that just having audio alone is probably going to be painful considering my history with audio quality, but looking at an unchanging picture for an hour would just be a waste of time. Go play a slow-paced video game or something while you listen. A fast-paced one would probably just make you tune out everything I'm saying, which is nothing useful really. It's better for both of us that way. I get more watch time while saving time and effort on worstest and forced visuals, and you get to avoid watching said visuals. Do what you will. Anyways, if you're interested in hearing about a systemic issue that's pretty much beyond fixing, and learn about every minute detail on how and why it's so flawed and unfixable, then stick around and join me on a road trip down a one-way road to nowhere. We'll make some stops to pick up some nothing burgers along the way. And before we start going on this wild goose chase, how about you grab one for the road? Because oh boy, is it going to be a long trip. As per tradition, I need to patronize my viewers first. So, if you fail to see how the education system has never worked to begin with, then you're probably just a fool, or someone who's been brainwashed by the educational system into believing that you actually gain something from it. Or perhaps you're a teacher that actually believes that what you're doing is actually teaching, while you're being oblivious to how ineffective using the same slideshow for decades on end is. Okay, now that we've gotten that out of my system, we can finally begin addressing the core issues with the educational system. I'm mostly going to be talking about the American education system, but most of it can be applied to other countries as well. Not like that's gonna stop this from becoming a disorganized mess as usual. I think I'll just list the individual issues first and then propose solutions near the end. Or maybe just do the solutions right after the issue. We'll see. The first issue would obviously be its general ineffectiveness. Truthfully, it isn't completely ineffective, but the scope of its effectiveness is so infinitesimally small that it might as well be. Incomplete information is the best way to describe it. And if you want to go deeper into the nuances that combine to form this mass of ineffectiveness, we'll have to start with the areas the educational system is lacking in, which would be the fundamental concepts and critical thinking skills. Despite what you've been led to believe in, schools don't actually prioritize teaching fundamental concepts and critical thinking skills. If you believe they do, then I'm afraid you've been played like a damn fiddle. You see, in both Western and Eastern education, the root of all problems stems from its creation. At first, the educational system was developed to actually teach, but the modern education system we currently use was first re-established to serve an industrial era, where the primary focus was in producing workers with basic skills, which is what ruined the original system. It's not difficult to see that the modern educational system has lost all intention to nurture personal growth and meaningful learning. It's more so about creating the next generation of cogs to maintain the economic machine that we know as a society, making it so that schools follow a one-size-fits-all model. Schools place an overemphasis on rote learning or memorization through repetition, along with focusing too much on standardized testing than deeper learning. So students end up learning how to pass exams instead of actually learning knowledge. And a personal observation of mine lies in how retakes of tests aren't usually allowed, which doesn't even attempt to hide the lack of care towards individual learning. If schools were truly about learning, then retaking exams would be encouraged, That way you learn from your mistakes. And in college, most of the time you don't even get your exams back, so you don't even know what you got wrong. How is one supposed to learn from their mistakes if you don't even know what the mistake was? And on top of that, it also creates a toxic environment where failure isn't tolerated. You're expected to know every scene perfectly in one go. And by every scene, I mean the decades of knowledge your teacher has accumulated for one subject in particular. The grading system is just another emphasis on standardized testing. Tests and quizzes take up a fairly large portion of your grade, while homework and other stuff fill in the rest. Problem is that the homework is often irrelevant to what you're tested on, and a lot of the time it's unnecessarily long, so it can take hours to finish a single homework assignment. And don't forget that you also have around 5 other classes to attend to. So you end up with an atrocious amount of irrelevant homework that doesn't contribute to learning and serves as busy work, which has a tendency to leave students with little time for studying, and students tend to resort to cheating to finish their homeworks quickly and get the points for it. And what ends up happening is that students learn to adapt to and play the system instead of learning meaningful knowledge. We basically memorize all we need for exams, then regurgitate it all once we're done with it. I think that the only part of education that's actually somewhat useful and necessary is fucking elementary school. Because in grades 1 through 6 you pretty much learn the basic skills like reading, writing, and simple mathematics, along with the worstness social studies and some shit about cells. But that's not even where most of the value comes from. The value from grade schools stems from the lack of busy work and the recess times. With the abundance of free time you have, you get to socialize and make friends, which is more valuable than everything else that comes from grade school. You develop far more social skills from grade school than you do from any other part of the educational system. And for the most part, you maintain those important skills throughout your entire life, with some exceptions like me who lost any and all social skills by being what I am. That being said, middle school and high school aren't exactly great for developing social skills. You're pretty much a ball of angst during that time, and there's like an entire social hierarchy within school that you now have to deal with, which I suppose is somewhat of a social skill since workplaces and whatnot. But anyways, the moment middle school starts, you start getting drowned in busy work. Recess gets pretty much nicked, and, well, I can't even remember what was taught in middle school. I think geometry was somewhere along the mix. Oh right, and half-assed sex ed. Can't forget about that time where people were screaming penis every 5 minutes. It just goes to show how inconsequential middle school is. Then high school cranks the busy work to 100 and now you don't even get breaks apart from allowing you to eat lunch. I remember even less about what was taught in high school, which is weird since I had some say in what classes I took, and yet I can't remember jack shit. And now, college. Apparently, you're now supposed to take prerequisite courses to prepare you for the higher level class. Yeah, that's definitely working out just well. I'm pretty much going in blind and stumbling around for the whole semester and barely managing to pass by some miracle. Why else would I have time to make shitty YouTube videos? It's because I stopped putting any effort into my schoolwork ages ago, after I found out that putting in effort made little to no difference. I performed just as badly as when I didn't study. But more now on standardized testing. The tests now don't even test you on your knowledge most of the time. It's more so about reading comprehension than comprehension of the actual subject, like SATs or maths, engineering, and just about any class with word problems. It's just a mindfuckery of word games, where you essentially have to untangle a web of lies to figure out what in the actual fuck the question wants you to answer. It doesn't matter how well you know the concept, if you can't decipher the convoluted question that no human being would word that way in a real-world scenario. Especially SATs. I'm pretty sure College Board intentionally made it that way so they can make billions from retakes. Anyways, I'll be complaining more here, but one of my shithead professors decided to incorporate the lore of some sci-fi series they loved, and wrote nonsensical questions with foreign sci-fi vocabulary, which just made the questions indecipherable. I can appreciate the love for sci-fi. Outside of teaching, they would probably be a person that's easy to get along with, someone you can talk about sci-fi lore to. But when it comes to exams, man, fuck you. My grades are suffering because you're inserting 2 fucking pages of lore for one word problem. I only learned about protons and electrons and you're here writing about antimatter. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you want to study something, well, then you should probably study the vocabulary associated with that subject. Like, one fucking maths exam asked me for the physical interpretation of an object. No clue what that meant, so obviously I failed. Anyways, let's move on before I start getting irrationally upset and get carried away with another rant. I don't think I really need to provide a solution to this problem. The solution itself is already pretty obvious, just like, I don't know, make the exams actually relevant to the contents of the class, instead of making the in-class lectures, homework, quizzes, and exams all completely disconnected and irrelevant from one another. You know, the most logical and rational thing a sane person would do. But the next issue we'll deal with is underfunding and resource constraints, which contributes just as much to the core issue as everything else. Lack of resources can diminish the quality of learning, like being stuck with outdated textbooks from 1964, lack of technological access, or having schools on the verge of falling apart. You know, stuff like that. Alright, and we can't forget about hiring teachers. More money means better teachers. Usually. But even if we receive proper funding, you know, the funding our tax dollars are supposedly going towards, resources are often allocated into the wrong areas. Schools tend to invest money towards improving their reputation and prestige rather than student learning, where the more prestigious a school is, the more funding it receives, therefore becoming a vicious cycle that forms a nasty Ouroboros devouring itself. Of course, we also come across the reoccurring problem where most teachers can't be bothered to give a shit about teaching properly. No matter how much you pay a teacher, you're just paying them to produce results by teaching. So you end up with teachers that can get away with presenting the same recycled slides they've been using for decades on end, and using the same old curricula they've taught each and every year, and still be able to call that teaching. Why? Because the students produce the desired results, and usually those results are produced by massive grade curves. As long as more than 50% of a class passes, then the desired results are there, and there will be no investigation into the teacher, because all that really matters is making more money. And if schools don't have to change anything, then they can save money. It's that stupid no child left behind policy. They don't care if you're at the same level as others. As long as you pass, it's good enough for them. Anyways, for every 10 crap teachers, there's at least one good or at least passionate teacher that makes learning entertaining, which unfortunately still doesn't make a goddamn difference. Because here's the thing. Passion doesn't equal teaching ability. Passion alone will get you absolutely nowhere without the ability to back it up. And then there's good teachers. Well, good is purely subjective, because one size doesn't fit all. Everybody has a unique way they learn most effectively, like visual learning, auditory learning, comprehensive, and stuff. Which means that a good teacher for you might be a worthless teacher who sounds like an adult from Charlie Brown to someone else. Which also means that no matter how passionate of a teacher you are, it doesn't matter. Because you can't possibly appeal to every single student's individual preferred method of learning. And here's another newsflash for you. Teachers usually get abysmally low pay, unless you're a professor at some prestigious college, and not to mention the fact that there is a high demand for teachers too. Usually the higher the demand, the better the pay, but that's hardly the case for teaching. It just shows you how little they care about quality education. With all this in mind, you can completely forget about having a teacher that cares about teaching. Even teachers that get paid well don't necessarily care about teaching. They just need to have more than half the class pass, so that the performance review greenlights them and they don't get put on academic probation with reduced pay. The classes you have with massive curves? Yeah, those ones. It's not the teacher being nice to their students or anything like that. It's just the teacher being shit at their one and only job, which is passing on knowledge. So if you hear a teacher bragging and warning you about how difficult a class is, like, okay, this is a no-nonsense class that will be very challenging, so you'll definitely have to crack open your textbook to pass this class, and I've always had a low pass rate. Well, kudos to you then. Maybe if you, I don't know, did your job properly, then you wouldn't have such an atrocious pass rate. If you have a teacher that says some bullshit along those lines, then it's an immediate red flag that the teacher is going to be worthless, and that you're going to need to dedicate quite some time to self-studying to pass a class, or get the fuck out as soon as you can and transfer to another teacher. Now, the core of this subsectional issue is that you can't really improve this aspect of the educational system due to the simple fact that teaching is a job. Human nature makes it so that working isn't exactly something you dedicate your heart and soul to, say for the few teachers with the pure and passionate intent of teaching. I can't imagine a teacher waking up full of energy and going, "Oh man, I can't wait to pass on my knowledge to young and impressionable minds." It's probably something more along the lines of, "God damn it, another day of repeating the same lesson to more rowdy little fucks. I'm going to need extra coffee today and a bottle of Tylenol." Anyways, it means that no matter how enticing you make the jobs pay, the quality of teaching won't necessarily improve, because teachers will always find a way to cut corners. After all, this isn't some video game where you can invest money to directly improve the specs of a character. Which brings me to the fact that results are all that matters. The ends justifies the means, so I'll be reiterating on that. Curving meets the desired results of the system. It doesn't matter if students actually learned anything. All that matters is the statistics, which comes in the form of their grades. As far as the school board is concerned, passing the class means you learned, and not because everyone in the class was failing equally horribly. So, after around 6 Google Doc pages of complaining and nitpicking at the flaws, I hope you can at least start to see why the current system is objectively getting worse, right? Especially with newer generations being mostly illiterate despite having access to education. Illiteracy was something that was common in the Renaissance era and the Dark Ages, but now it's somehow affecting the newest generation, which would be Gen Alpha. If you still can't see it, then I believe that you might just be an unbelievable dullard. Now that I think about it, I don't think the educational system has worsened by that much. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely gotten progressively worse over the years, but I don't think it's gotten worse by a massive margin. Instead, what I think happened is that the educational system has always more or less been this incompetent, and has just been ever so slowly deteriorating throughout the years. Allow me to explain. See here, when I was in grade school, the concept of brain rot didn't exist yet. So I spent my time reading Harry Potter, Percy Jackson, The Inheritance Cycle, and whatnot. And all the other children read books too, which improved our vocabulary skills and allowed us to learn by ourselves, which was enough to compensate for the lacking literacy taught in the educational system. It allowed us to actually understand a bit of what was being taught, however useless most of it ended up being. But with the internet finally settling in the past decade or so, Gen Alpha has become much more different from my generation. Gen Alpha has brain rot as an alternative to reading, and brain rot is just quick and easily accessible dopamine rushes which makes reading much less appealing, which in turn has revealed just how incompetent and flawed the educational system inherently is. With Gen Alpha choosing brain rot over reading, students are no longer supplementing those areas schools are lacking in, which is probably why there's such an alarming spike in illiteracy. The system was always this bad. We just never noticed it because of a masking effect where independent reading and studying was enough to maintain an equilibrium to actively counteract the lack of educational quality. But the introduction of brain rot has suddenly disrupted that very equilibrium, tipping the scales one-sidedly enough that only now are we being forced to notice the obvious flaws. And to make matters worse, nowadays information is everywhere thanks to the internet, which isn't a bad thing by itself. But along with that ease of access to information, the job market has been changing far too rapidly due to that shift, especially when we consider the introduction of increasingly more and more refined artificial intelligence, which has completely wrecked the job market into smithereens and is already rendering most computer science jobs obsolete. I knew some people who majored in computer science, and 5 years later they're still looking for a job. Not because they were incompetent. Those people went to far better colleges than I did, But because the job market for computer science is in complete disarray thanks to artificial intelligence, which once again brings me to the stagnation of the educational system. The system hasn't changed at all since the industrial era. Schools don't adapt quickly enough, if at all, to the diverse needs of students thanks to the now ever-changing job market. The entire system is still pushing the same old goddamn curricula, focusing on worthless things like standardized testing or unconventional information with no practical applications. It fails to teach crucial life skills like doing taxes or finance management. All the system has done is ripped off the fucking slogan for environmental sustainability and applied reuse, reduce, recycle to education, which, mind you, does not work at all. It completely fails to foster genuine intellectual curiosity among students. In fact, it does quite the opposite of that. It makes students despise education, and as a consequence of that, they start harboring ill will towards learning too. And here's the punchline to this colossal joke we call an educational system. People in general don't actually hate learning. In fact, learning is an inherent part of human nature. Our natural curiosity encourages us to learn about stuff. We're where we are today because of learning. What we hate is the educational system itself, and the lack of actual learning we gain from a so-called place for learning. All of this fuckery creates a massive chasm of disconnect between the necessities a student needs to succeed in life and what actually gets taught to them. And that chasm is vast enough to make even the Grand Canyon piss itself so badly that the Colorado River will have turned into a river of piss. Emotional intelligence, creativity, problem-solving, and practical skills get completely ignored in favor of pursuing memorization and narrow academic focuses, leading to people like me with one-dimensional thinking. Why do you think my organizational skills are so lacking? I mean, you have to deal with my verbosity because of the educational system failing to teach me the necessary skills. Go blame them instead. It just ends up being the same tiresome and unchanging pattern. That being said, there are also many educators and institutions striving to improve things via integrating technology, shifting to more personalized learning, or encouraging students with a less linear system, like project-based education. Even with these clear challenges, they're doing their best to innovate and address the shortcomings. But even so, it's not enough. Those individual actions are nothing more than fruitless efforts when the whole system is rotten to the core. You can't save a tree by simply pruning a few of its branches, when the entire tree itself is diseased. Maybe if it was only a few branches that were diseased you could, but this tree's disease begins at its roots. Sometimes you need to cut down or uproot the entire tree to allow for a new seedling to sprout in its place. The current state of affairs has too many systemic flaws to fix that it's just easier to start anew. The bad outweighs the good by just that much. The current system feeds you nothing more than information to memorize, without actually teaching them. You just memorize formulas and keywords and try to figure out the patterns on when to apply them to education-specific questions. You don't learn innovation or why this information is useful to you, much less how it can be used. Instead, you're told when to use it without question. And what ends up happening is that you essentially learn how to adapt to the educational system, which results in some straight-A students often being completely lost on what to do once they get dropped out of grad school and into the real world. Students that snack off will likely experience the same things, save for the ones that just don't understand how the educational system works as a whole and fail to adapt to it, but can end up being exceptional when it comes to understanding and applying information to the real world. And not to mention the fact that most schoolwork that's assigned and taught to you ends up being exponentially more difficult than 99% of jobs, or even ends up being completely useless info that most jobs don't even require you to use. Unless it's some job that involves the theoretical, like theoretical physics, where you don't really do anything and pretend like you are most of the time. At times, I don't think even your teacher understands some of the content in the course. I'd say this aspect pretty much encapsulates the frustration many people feel towards the education system. We effectively learn how to play the system rather than truly understanding and applying knowledge in a meaningful way, leading to that sense of disillusionment for straight-A students who excelled within the system, but find themselves lost when facing real-world situations, while the people that didn't succumb to the system and perform poorly in academics might end up doing better in practical situations, except for the ones that just cause trouble. The system rewards the ones that adapt to its structure, which doesn't cultivate the much-needed critical thinking, creativity, and real-world problem-solving skills that matter most outside of school. The mind-numbing and tunnel vision focus on standardized testing and strict curricula strips away any room for actual curiosity and deeper understanding to develop. Like, most of you probably didn't even know that blood cells are not actually capable of replicating themselves. They don't undergo mitosis. See there? Isn't that interesting? And that info will probably stick with you for quite a while. Just like how all you can probably remember is that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Hell, I don't think I even know what cell types actually undergo mitosis. You kinda just feel like you're going through the motions instead of truly learning. Most jobs require practical, social, or even situational skills, and most of what you're taught in school doesn't translate directly into most jobs. These skills can't be developed by just sitting in a classroom memorizing equations, and schoolwork being irrelevant or more difficult compared to actual jobs makes you feel like school is about jumping through hoops instead of learning skills for life. I mean, I just had a class where their exams were awful, but students were able to adapt to that specific style of exams. But for the final, 2 professors decided to have a collab nobody asked for, and wrote the final together, which fucked over both classes with an unfamiliar exam format of bullshit. For a while now, I've just been tuning out professors as I can't make heads or tail of their lectures, and all I hear is garbled nonsense. So I either just don't attend, fiddle around with mobile games, or work on a video script, since attending lectures is far from a conducive usage of my time. It's more worthwhile to just learn by myself while making videos. And despite my non-participation, I'm still doing just as equally horribly as the students that dedicate themselves towards attendance and studying. My existence is a mockery towards the system. I'm doing the bare minimum to the point where I'm hardly even participating. I'm merely muddling my way through, and yet I'm still failing as miserably as the ones that are actively applying themselves. That should give you an idea of just how broken the system is, which brings me to the grand solution. As far as teaching goes, human error is something you can't fix no matter how hard you try. Which is why I believe that the future of teaching lies in artificial intelligence. In theory, a perfected or more refined artificial intelligence checks most of the boxes and can become the best available resource for teaching. Artificial intelligence in general holds quite a lot of potential in the future for a more personalized learning experience. It would be able to provide unprecedented levels of personalized education by tailoring its approach to individual students and by analyzing the students' progress and picking out their strengths and weaknesses. It would also be able to gather enough data to adapt to each student's learning style instantaneously and provide much-needed personalized feedback and reassuring encouragement, along with explanations that resonate with individual students enough so that they actually understand it. Artificial intelligence is everything that an ideal human teacher should aim to be, except without the constraints of time and resources. The AI will be able to continuously evolve by analyzing and learning from its interactions with students, being able to constantly update and refine itself by incorporating the latest knowledge and pedagogical techniques. But we can take things one step further and make the AI an even perfecter teacher by giving it the same thought process as a human, which would essentially just be a self-conscious AI. This does pose some ethical and existential questions. Would the self-conscious AI develop desires or autonomy? And how ethical would it be to force a truly self-conscious AI to teach without any consideration for its needs or desires? Would society even be able to balance the potential of such technology and the concerns around control, autonomy, and artificial intelligence rights? Then there's the fact that having a fully self-conscious AI would just nullify the need for humans to learn in the first place. Not to mention the fact that we could just as easily get Skynet. But this regarding all that drivel. A self-conscious AI would theoretically be the perfect teacher. On top of its adaptability to personalized teaching, the addition of self-consciousness will allow the AI to account for emotional and mental states and adjust accordingly, much like a human tutor would, except far more efficiently. But even with its overwhelming potential, the AI will still run into a dead end, which takes form as the barrier of human desire. Not even a perfect AI can teach someone who doesn't want to learn. The best it can do is try to appeal to the individual's interest to somehow rope them into wanting to learn, either by inspiring curiosity or making lessons more engaging. But in the end, the intrinsic desire to learn must stem from the student himself. Even AI would struggle against a student who has disengaged from the process entirely. And in this light, AI wouldn't be able to combat nihilism either, which are two problems we'll get to fairly quickly. As of now, AI is still unsuitable for teaching, since it's still flawed and incomplete. It lacks the refinement needed for proper teaching due to its failure in nuanced understanding. It's very much still in development. But I genuinely believe that one day a fully AI-driven educational system could easily overcome the limitations of human-led education sometime in the future, and replace many of the traditional aspects of teaching. Artificial intelligence will be the closest thing to a perfect teaching system. I mean, you could also have one-on-one teaching, but who are we kidding here? That's even more unrealistic than AI teaching. Good luck finding that many teachers willing to teach one-on-one. Besides, sooner or later you're gonna end up with a sudden spike in pedophilia. So, until AI becomes a viable resource for teaching, I strongly believe that independent study stemming from personal interest is the most effective way to truly learn. It doesn't even necessarily need to be an artificial intelligence-based system. All you really need is the will to learn, which of course is the next issue I need to somehow come up with a solution for. Let's set things in motion with a theoretical scenario of, what if we somehow managed to rebuild the educational system from scratch and eliminate all of its flaws? Or even if we just had the perfect AI teacher, we would immediately run into another obstacle that, in my opinion, is an even more difficult one to overcome. This time it's no systemic issue. Even though it kind of is, we'll get to the specifics on that later. Instead, it's the will to freaking learn. Even if we solved every issue we discussed prior to this segment, and managed to achieve a perfect learning environment, it's ultimately worthless if there is no will to learn. You can't teach someone who doesn't want to learn. No matter how perfect the teacher is or how good the educational tools available are, they will ultimately face the inherent limitations created by the lack of motivation to learn. You simply can't teach an unwilling student, and this unwillingness comes largely from societal and systemic issues. The reality of human will is that no amount of perfect teaching, be it human or AI, can impart knowledge onto someone who has no motivation or intention to learn. Curiosity and the will to learn are deeply personal things that are often shaped by individual circumstances, environment, and experiences, which is a problem the educational system faces, past, present, and most likely will still be an issue in the foreseeable future too. Motivation and engagement are sorely lacking in a current system that has created a toxic environment where students are obligated to learn and not because they're inspired to do so. Issues like boredom, anxiety, and external factors are all factors that kill motivation. And in this age of entertainment and overstimulation, boredom and anxiety are constant factors, as people are overwhelmed by the sheer number of options to pick and choose from. And entertainment serves to distract you from deeper issues like unaddressed emotions that end up causing you anxiety. And the will to learn ultimately brings me to the next issue: nihilism, the inherent purposelessness and meaninglessness in everything, which ties in quite nicely to human will. Part of the reason as to why so many students have no motivation is due to the fact that there are people with more nihilistic views towards education, and think that there's no point in learning and hold no interest in anything. as society has slowly been worsening into a more dreary dystopia. There's an ever-increasing amount of nihilism and apathy people feel towards education and life in general. And you can't say otherwise. Most people will get the sense that nothing matters, so why bother learning? Which is usually caused by feeling disconnected and overwhelmed by the current state of society. The traditional narratives such as learning for your own future and education equals success fall on deaf ears. People still fail to find any value in the future or success, so the message fails to resonate, which as one would imagine makes it an arduous challenge to even spark an interest in learning, much less sustain that spark over time. Nihilism is a major roadblock for life in general nowadays, and even if you aren't a nihilist, there are those that just want to live life unburdened by things they see as a burden, such as traditional education and work, which they view as a necessary work to learn information they don't want to know, which also ties into the growing sense that much of what we get forced to learn feels irrelevant and useless to real life. Why should I spend years learning things I'll never use? Life skills and practical knowledge should be prioritized over the abstract academic concepts you are pressured into learning. Learning through experience or letting people learn by doing can lead to more engagement than just sitting in a classroom memorizing formulas that are completely disconnected from personal goals, and just listening to a teacher drone on and on about things while you space out. Some people are simply looking for meaning or purpose beyond material success, and education provides none of that, making it far too easy to lose motivation. And I don't think I can come up with a definitive solution for that. The best I could do was mostly just suggestions on how we can maybe inspire the will to learn, which I'll show you now. Oh god, it's 7 pages long. That's like 15 to 20 minutes. Well, anyways, let's start with children, because that's where all learning starts. I have some ideas on possible ways to inspire the use. The basis of my suggestions mostly comes from the fact that when you're a child, you have almost boundless amounts of curiosity, but at the same time you're far too easily distracted by other things. After all, children are notorious for jumping from one interest to another. You can ask a child what they want to be when they grow up, and that answer could change within the span of a few weeks or days, or even as they're heading home. The bountiful natural curiosity children possess is an exceptional strength that the traditional educational system fails oh so miserably at leveraging, thanks to its inflexibility. It allows for little to no flexibility and basically just forces students into a rigid curriculum. And as a result, not only do they kill that innate strength children have, they turn their excitement to learn into boredom, and something they actively avoid, which they do by discouraging exploration by funneling children into a predefined one-way road that hardly ever aligns with the passions of children. Like, plenty of children wanted to become astronauts, because space was cool. But even now I still don't know what requirements you actually need to fulfill to become an astronaut. I could probably just Google it, but that's not the point. The point is that schools don't even try to appeal to the passions of children. There's not even an attempt to focus on one thing in particular. Instead, you're met with general education, which persists all the way to college, where you get to choose your major, but you're still forced to take gen ed classes that have nothing to do with your major. I mean, it's not even until you go into grad school where you actually focus on your major. Only then do you actually learn stuff that's relevant. But you're already in your mid-20s by then. Do you honestly believe that great scientists became that great from what was taught in school? No. They only became that great after they escaped the clutches of the system, where they pursued their own research. Your educational journey only began after leaving the educational system. And I know that there are exceptions. But what good are exceptions when the majority end up the same way? I believe that the most obvious way to fix an inflexible system is simply making it more flexible and allow students to pursue whatever captivates them at the moment, rather than sticking strictly to some predetermined syllabus. I mean, hell, Bring in some professionals to talk about what's necessary for their jobs or something. That way, you can at least sustain the fiery ambition and energy children have towards learning. I mean, even project-based learning helps children become familiar with active real-world challenges, where students see the immediate results, impact, and application of what you're learning, which can help foster the fleeting interest into deep engagement since the students will now have full control over their learning and pave their own road. And I'm not talking about projects like basic vocational projects that have been done to death already. Children only choose those because they're being graded on their projects. And why experiment with an uncertain project that could decimate your grade when you could just copy something that's already been done countless times? Which is why the grading system will likely also need to be dismantled along with a more flexible approach. As a student, if you received a less than satisfactory grade for a project you spent plenty of time and effort on, but didn't work out in the end, you'd essentially just have been told that your efforts are subpar and results are all that matter. But in essence, education needs to shift from being something that's imposed on you to something that enhances life in a meaningful way. And while we're talking about enhancing life in a meaningful way, we might as well go deeper into the nihilistic issues involved in education. That spark children have for learning? Yeah, well, that spark is slowly flickering away as newer generations are becoming increasingly depressed, and as a result are proportionally becoming more disengaged, uninterested, and generally just nihilistic towards traditional education. The environment children are being born into now is extremely shitty, to put it simply. Ultimately, we'll need to somehow inspire the newer generations amidst the awful environment for development. Again, a flexible action would help a ton with that. But the best course of actions to take would probably be to make the system more meaningful and relevant to an individual's goals and worldview. But even with that being done, it's still not enough to overcome the intrinsic disinterest some people face. Fleeting passions, apathy, or just the desire for a simple life without any unnecessary complications to burden their lives are all reasons why people might become disinterested in education. For some, education will always just be a never-ending chore to them. Restructuring it to align with their interests and values might help. Just finding ways to make learning more relevant to a student's lives, goals, and interests. But even then, there's no guarantee it will work. Besides, I don't think we can really do much to inspire people that aren't children. As you grow older, you usually become less impressionable, unless you are an avid Twitter user. At the end of the day, when you're no longer a child, the will to learn is just that, your personal will. It's something meant for individuals to cultivate themselves. External influences can't really do much to that. Now, you could integrate a more purpose-driven form of learning into the system by connecting their individual learning to something they deeply care about, even if it's something outside the conventional paths of societal success, or even just teaching critical thinking and existential exploration. By incorporating some philosophy into the curriculum, we may be able to aid nihilistic students in finding a purpose, instead of simply memorizing facts. Perhaps engaging in meaningful discussions about the philosophy of human experience and human existence could maybe help those experiencing nihilistic blues. But even if schools focused more on personal meaning and life relevance, it's ultimately still kind of pointless because nihilism is inherently right. Life has no inherent meaning or purpose to it. The whole point of living is to find your own purpose. And having someone to teach that very purpose contradicts that very notion. Teaching meaning in a world where meaning is either self-created or inherently absent will always feel inauthentic and artificial to some. At the end of the day, society and its components of work and education can only resonate with those who actively choose to find meaning in them. For everyone else, it is simply about navigating the system just to live another day, instead of fully engaging and embracing them by becoming part of the collective consciousness. And besides, no matter what we implement into the educational system, A large portion of people will still opt to disengage thanks to the social construct we call society. Nihilism unavoidably brings us to the social construct of a society. I know that there's a certain stigma around people blaming and denouncing society as a whole, thanks to shit like Joker. And those people tend to get a lot of flack for it. But even so, while those people may just be blaming everything that goes wrong in their life on society, the blame isn't result basis. You have to recognize that society as a whole is filled with countless flaws, and that even the stigma around rejecting society is yet another artificially constructed norm for the gullible. Between a utopia and a dystopia, we're definitely leaning more towards a dystopia. I'd even go as far as to say that we're doing a Michael Jackson lean. Nihilistic views can make the drive to learn feel utilitarian at best. I learn because I need to, not because it fulfills me. In a nihilistic light, I'd say that the source of motivation for work and education delves down to being a simple survival instinct, rather than ambition to engage with work or education for passion or fulfillment. It's just a necessity, carried out with begrudging motivation at best. It's nothing more than a necessity for survival. You don't have much of a choice in the matter. It's an ultimatum between life and death, and I think quarantine proved that to us. At home we had a choice, and we always chose to snack off and avoid working properly whenever we had the chance. Like I just mentioned, meaning in life is something that's meant for each person to discover themselves. Teaching it in a standardized way undermines the very idea of it being something unique to each individual. And in a way, society is already trying to teach you the meaning to your life. You're just a cog to keep the machine running. Trying to instill meaning through institutions like schools can feel artificial or hollow. And imposed purpose is just false and forced, which can create more tension in society. Does any of this sound familiar to you? The societal structures, schools, jobs, careers, and whatnot are based upon shared values. And in many ways their purposes are mere constructs to serve the economical machine, bringing us to the role of society and constructed meaning. Society is essentially built upon shared values and goals in order to try and create structure and order. And you want to know the fun part of all these shared values? Remember when I said way back at the beginning about schools aiming for prestige? Yeah, well, the prestige of a school makes little difference in the grand scheme of things. You could go to a community college or Harvard, but at the end of the day, the only real difference is how likely you are to get hired for a specific job. As far as your earnings go, well, no matter what job you get, as long as it's a traditional working job, you're still going to end up working decades before you can retire. A modest lifestyle is usually 30 to 40 grand a year, while a more comfortable lifestyle is 50 to 70 grand a year, and a luxury lifestyle is like 100 grand. So if you want to retire at the age of 30, you would need to save up anywhere between $1 to $5 million just as an extremely rough estimate. We're not even going to get into details about the countless economic factors such as fluctuating banking interest rates and the constant inflation you have to compete against. In all likelihood, you would need to spend quite a lot of effort investing. Now, you do the math on that. Assuming you earn $250,000 a year, you would first need to be either a specialist in the medical field like a surgeon or somethingologist, a higher-ranking lawyer, or just someone holding a higher-ranking position in general like CEO, CFO, CTO, a manager, or whatnot. As far as traditional jobs go, at least. Athletics, music, and entertainment don't count since they don't follow the traditional path of the educational system, which is what this entire video is about. Now, if we're being generous, it takes you a bare minimum of 5 years to save up $1 million, assuming that you spend $50,000 annually. But here's the kicker. Most of these jobs require you to attend grad school to get a higher level of education for a better degree. And grad school is after college. And college is something you complete at around the age of 22. So if you want to go for a measly master's degree, So if you want to go for a measly master's degree, you still need to wait until you're at 26 years of age or something to start working. Oh, and did I forget to mention that a master's degree usually nets you a salary of $100,000, which effectively doubles the time you need to work in order to retire. And not to mention the fact that we aren't even accounting for other factors like the atrocious amounts of student debt you've racked up over the past 8 or so years. But let's go back to the $250,000 a year. To achieve that, you would almost certainly need a professional degree of some sort unless you have special circumstances, like being a generational prodigy or something. Want to guess how long professional degrees take to obtain? 7 to 11 years, with 4 years being the usual graduation time and 3 to 7 years for the residency period. And sure, in residency you get paid like $50,000 a year. But if you're on the side that takes 7 years, you'll end up being 33 or 34 by the time you obtain a complete degree. At that point, you're already almost middle-aged, and your use has already started deteriorating in your late 20s. Oh, and here's another fun part. Around 5 to 10% of people die before they become middle-aged. I can't ascertain how accurate these values are. It's just an estimate from watching the people around me. Which means you might not even get to reap the fruits of your decades of efforts. Now, assuming that you finish grad school at the age of 30, you're still going to need to work until you're at least 35. If you just disregard debt, insurance, and every other factor that would otherwise cripple your retirement plan. And once you're 35, you can retire with the bare minimum of $1 million and live a modest life, where you're now free to start a family at, well, the age of 35. And God forbid if you have children, because if you do, then it's back to working for you. You're going to need money to take care of your children's needs and save up for their college tuition. And boy fucking hell does life suck. People don't want to live longer. They want to maintain their youth longer. Living longer just means waking up each day and slowly losing all your bodily functions, and having your quality of life become more miserable in general. For me, no matter how much I study, I'm still going to end up with some job that pays up to $100,000 a year, meaning that I'll still have to work decades before I can retire. It's completely meaningless when no matter what you do, you still have to spend decades working before you retire. And you might not even get to live multiple decades. I'm already constantly being reminded of my mortality. Why the hell do you think I'm even making videos? I mean, sure, I do enjoy the learning to some degree, but for the most part, it's so that I won't end up trapped in this shitty system. It pisses me off with just how abysmal it all is. Do you understand now how nihilism ties into society? Once you realize how futile your efforts are, people end up feeling disconnected from the constructs of society, and find the rules and expectations of society to be arbitrary and oppressive. It creates a dissonance, especially when our societal structure is ever so insistent on participation in education and work, even if it doesn't resonate with an individual's sense of purpose. Which means that there will always be people with a sense of disillusionment, or a conscious rejection of societal principles and expectations, who don't engage with society and willingly subject themselves to 3 decades of imprisonment. These are the limitations of education, the system that was re-established to prepare people for survival in society. But it's far too easy to see through the social constructs underpinning it, making it feel even more like a hollow exercise, a system of begrudging participants where they don't see another way out, rather than finding it meaningful. You're trapped in the system with little chance of escaping, which ties in with the inherent limitation of trying to inspire engagement through education or work. There will always be people that reject it, seeing work and education as components of a system they don't believe in. It's already difficult enough to navigate the fog of uncertainty to see what awaits you in the future, and the crappiness of the educational system just makes the fog even denser than it already is, to the point where not only can you not see anything, but you can hardly even breathe. At the very best, work and education are necessary evils, And at its worst, it's a system to be completely subverted or avoided. It's not hard for people to see through the transparency of these constructs and feel that life's inherent meaninglessness makes participation in such systems feel all the more empty and begrudging. It's just that ignorance is bliss. Which is where we loop back around to those that adopt a more nihilistic and existential view, where the world lacks inherent meaning, making it so that motivation mostly comes from necessity for survival and maintaining a certain standard of living. It's not necessarily from a deeper drive, giving them the sense that learning, working, or even engaging with society is something you have to do, not because you're passionate about it or find intrinsic value in it. In this light, education in its traditional form just becomes another part of the societal structure one has to endure. For most people, survival ends up being the primary motivator for both learning and working, which means they most likely won't find any enjoyment or fulfillment in it. In such a context, schools merely serve to mold and prepare students to function within such an empty construct, acquiring the necessary knowledge and skills to sustain themselves. But as we said before, schools fail to do even that. It creates a difficult situation, especially for those that aren't naturally inclined to figure things out outside of the structure imposed by the system. No matter what we implement into the educational system, large portion will still opt to disengage thanks to the social construct we call society. I think Cookie Clicker lore does a pretty good job of explaining it all. But anyways, throughout this entire video we've just been going in circles as new problems kept rising up, and we've slowly come to the realization that none of the solutions are all that achievable realistically. There are definitely more achievable solutions, but none of them will achieve an effective enough level of change to matter. So we just finished things off by discussing the near impossibility of change, as well as a mini rant. Well, being the pessimist that I am, I've come to the conclusion that the entire system is just mega fucked, and that it's a systemic issue beyond fixing. Don't get me wrong, knowing humans, change is definitely possible, but highly unlikely. And even if change does take place, it will likely take a long and arduous amount of time that spans far beyond my own lifespan. I did also come up with several socially unacceptable solutions myself, along with some acceptable and achievable solutions that are highly unlikely to occur with the current societal structure being such shit show that it is. Just take a look at how society functions as a whole, specifically the governmental system, and you'll see why the ideas I've come up with will be extremely difficult to implement. To change the educational system is essentially the same as trying to change the government, since it's a construct of society. It's borderline impossible unless you uproot the entire scene and start from scratch. Their roots are already buried too deep like some parasitic tree. I say we just fucking burn the whole tree to the ground and plant a new one. But anyways, let's address the systemic issues first. The summation of which is basically just crap teachers, crap government, overemphasis on standardized testing, and a general lack of giving a shit. Realistically, you can't do anything about the teachers. At the end of the day, a job is a job. Passion doesn't equal competence, and one size doesn't fit all. Logically, real change to this current system would require us to rethink how we approach education as a whole, which would consist of embracing more individualized learning, such as project-based education, or creating a system designed to encourage self-motivated learning as opposed to forced compliance. The only rational way I can see students achieve any amount of learning in the current system would be through independent study stemming from personal interest. I believe that independent studying is one of the best ways to actually learn. When you're motivated and engaged in something that genuinely interests you, it becomes much easier to go beyond paltry memorization, and you can really start to understand and apply information you learn along the way. And the internet, along with other resources, have made self-study more accessible than ever before. But it takes a lot of personal drive, which is something that the education system fails to foster with its focus on compliance and rule following. Yes, there's some concerns around misinformation on the internet, but before the internet became a scene, Misinformation was far more prominent than it was now, with knowledge mostly being passed down orally or in outdated texts. Yes, the internet has made information more widespread, but along with it comes unprecedented tools for verifying information. The pros far outweigh the cons of the internet, which is part of why the current system has failed so badly. They rely too much on textbooks which are outdated. Recently, it has been getting better with shift towards digital textbooks and other online resources. But the textbooks themselves are usually verbal vomit that doesn't provide substantial enough information to garner interest, or accomplish much transference of knowledge. Sometimes they even force you to use scholarly sources and prohibit any usage of AI, acting like they teach better than AI. I mean, last time I tried doing a project using Google Scholar, the only sources I got were from the 1970s. Surely that's not outdated information, right? I mean, just look at my videos. There's no better demonstration of independent learning. Sure, I get fed up with just about everything concerning the video making part, but you can at least kind of tell that I have some level of genuine interest in what I'm researching. I can learn more in a week of making a video than an entire year of disconnected and incomplete information taught at schools. The only things that bogged me down in my independent learning is ironically the educational system, taking up most of my time and draining me of my willpower, along with my ever-present feeling of hopelessness. Right, anyways. It might take generations of consistent effort since history has shown that with such significant shifts in society, be it political, cultural, or economic, they often take decades or centuries to fully manifest. Human societies have a tendency to experience incremental change after all, and those changes usually just end up leading us right back to square one, with history repeating itself. Especially when it comes to deeply entrenched systems such as education and governance. The government serves as a force of constant resistance to rapid change, which tends to stem from fear of instability or from self-interest. Because if you fight against a system that resists change, there will be countless who suffer from risking what little security they have, since that very system is where they derive their livelihood from, however flawed it is. We can recognize all the flaws quite easily, but just knowing what's wrong does nothing if you can't change it. Part of why change doesn't happen is because human adaptability ends up becoming a crutch, where many will prefer to abide by the flawed but familiar system, instead of embracing the uncertainty of change. It's safer to just accept the status quo. People are too afraid to take that first step. They fear that if they do take that step, then the ground might immediately begin to crumble beneath their feet. If we take a look at past social movements such as civil rights, worker rights, and the shifts in cultural norms about gender or the environment, all of them have taken countless years of effort, and to this day there are people still struggling for some of them. The people who started those movements have never once lived to see the full realization of their goals, which suggests that if my ideal form of change does take place, then it will most likely end up being another long-term social movement, especially when it comes to a system as deeply ingrained as education, resulting in a similar if not longer timeline. Educational reform is something that requires a significant shift in cultural values. The unlikeliness of change comes from the simple fact that change usually happens in response to crisis or pressure. Large-scale reforms are usually driven by external circumstances that force societies to rethink their values, such as cultural revolutions, economic collapse, and technological disruptions, all of which we are already starting to show signs of. Sometimes humanity needs another 9/11 to change. A large-scale crisis or a disruptive force of equal caliber might make change happen faster, but barring that, progress will most likely end up being incremental at best. The only possible way I can foresee such change happening within my lifetime is through complete destruction of the current system. My beliefs stem in violence, which would be forced destruction of the system through a revolution. History has shown that revolutions are quite effective when they work out. It only takes maybe a decade for changes to start happening, but revolutions also tend to bring about instability, which means that the changes might not last long. And of course, most people will prefer to avoid a revolution since it usually leads to bloodshed, anarchy, societal unrest, and whatnot. I only chose a revolution because I'm simple-minded like that. It's simple and straightforward. Consequences be damned. But realistically, revolutions only happen when the accumulated outrage of the people reaches a tipping point and bursts forth like a crimson flood. The alternatives would include somehow replacing all of the current government without using violence, which is a fucking pain in the ass since most governments just practice cronyism, where all the people in the government are old windbags on the verge of dementia, participating in one giant circle jerk. The current governance of the world has long since gone stagnant, where change is usually unwelcome unless it benefits the one in power. Hence the ever-increasing pressure on education to produce productive workers. The same families have been in governance for generations by now, with no sign of change. Election campaigns have devolved into a competition between dumb and dumber, where voting is just choosing the lesser evil or being blindsided by empty promises. So we're left with the ultimatum of either accepting this reality and focusing on your personal survival and autonomy, or trying to change an inherently flawed system that's dug its vapid roots far too deep into the earth. This me being me, obviously I think that accepting this reality and being self-centered for the sake of survival is certainly the easiest course of action to take. After all, it's a hassle to go on some crusade for something that won't even directly benefit me, and plenty of people feel the same way as I do. Acceptance would essentially perpetuate the very system we feel trapped in, leading to a form of resigned existence where we acknowledge the flaws, but it's such a hopeless endeavor to change them that we just end up doing nothing. But the reality is, all we would accomplish by doing that is pigeonholing ourselves even deeper into the same bottomless pit we're already in. Trying to change the system would be the best choice for the sake of humanity's future. Trying to change the system would be the best choice for the sake of humanity's future. But god damn it if human nature doesn't complicate the process of change. The overwhelming hurdle in trying to change the system is inherently difficult given how power structures work, and the active resistance to change unless it benefits those in power. The system has warped into a tool for maintaining power. Like I said, it's just a massive circle jerk, meant for producing obedient and productive workers you can toss away. Individuals who can fill roles within the economy with complete disregard for personal fulfillment or critical thinking. Stagnation of governance and resistance to change stems purely from the fact that those in power benefit from the current structure. There's no incentive for them to push for fundamental changes in the system, because they already have productive workers to maintain economic growth and stability, which allows them to fatten their wallets while sitting there and just twiddling their thumbs all day. Education focuses on producing even more of these workers, well-suited individuals to contribute to the workforce, but with no ability to challenge or disrupt the status quo. Human nature makes us resist change when it threatens an established power structure, both at the level of government and within society itself. And self-interest is just another part of that nature. Ones in power won't usually support changes that don't directly benefit them, while the lower caste of society are too busy prioritizing their own survival within the system instead of fighting for reform. You and I will both gatekeep the things that benefit us and refuse to share them. It's essentially keeping the masses busy by pitting them against each other while the ones at top reap all the benefits. Even if a country calls themselves a democracy, at the end of it all, governments are twisted into divide and rule or divide and conquer. I know I'm getting repetitive at this point, but all this just further reinforces the already daunting system. The pressure to maintain economic stability and productivity outweighs the desire for meaningful reform by a landslide. I'm sure many people are already more than aware of the system's flaws, but still find it easier to work within it than to fight against it, especially when survival and personal autonomy are at stake. Pressure on education is what has forced the system into this state. We don't foster well-rounded critical thinkers. We just prep students to enter the workforce by teaching job-specific skills that help function within an economy, but no critical thinking, creativity, or thinking for themselves and questioning societal norms. It's what ultimately led to the rise of woke people and the lot. Stupidity is running rampant thanks to echo chambers people create to make themselves feel better. At the beginning, I said that schools compete for prestige. Well, we've come back to that now. The standards for schools end up measuring success by how well they prepare students for economic productivity, instead of how well they help students develop a sense of purpose or meaning. This pressure not only narrows the scope of education, but also cuts off the space for individual expression or exploration. It's a systemic funnel that channels students into predefined roles for the sake of the larger economic structure, without consideration for benefiting individuals or society as a whole in terms of growth, progress, or well-being. The system doesn't treat students as humans. Students are more so toys they can throw away the moment they stop being useful. The immense stagnation of society is why changing the system requires such a monumental amount of effort. It's what happens when incompetence is running the affairs of the world. It's an almost impossible challenge to overcome. It requires a collective effort to challenge the already deeply entrenched power structures and societal norms. And with the disillusionment many people feel towards society, they don't have much of a will to challenge the structure. What we need is shifting values from economic productivity being the ultimate goal, and towards a model of prioritizing personal autonomy and fulfillment. But a shift like this would not only require changes in policy, but it would also need a change in culture, and human nature once again becomes an obstacle due to cultural inertia. The tendency to stick with what's familiar makes it all the more difficult for large-scale change to take root, especially when people's livelihoods are tied to that very system we want to dismantle. At the same time, I also don't think it will be long before we reach a breaking point. I mean, South Korea just tried enacting martial law recently, and that got rescinded in a matter of hours. The world order is treading on thin ice. We're already teetering on the brink of civil unrest. There's only so much people can tolerate before they snap. At this point, I'm losing track of what I've already said and haven't said. Organization was never my strong suit. But education in its ideal form has the potential to be a tool for liberation, empowering individuals to think critically and challenge the status quo to find their own paths. But in its current state, it's just a tool for conformity. Education needs to teach people how to think instead of what to think. Social responsibility is part of what we need. Right now, it's just half-hearted obligation. Merely accepting the current reality may be the easiest course of action, but it's ultimately a short-term solution that leaves the system untouched. And eventually that system will collapse on itself. And we're already seeing signs of that with Gen Alpha. In another 20 years, the world might enter a state of chaos as Gen Alpha begins to enter the workforce. A collective will to challenge and change the system, which is lacking in a world of self-interest and personal survival, dominates the current status of things. Which is why I thought that the most realistic course of action would be a revolution. But only now that I remember that history has a tendency to repeat itself. Even if a revolution did happen, the same exact scene tends to be re-established from the ashes. The wrong people end up in power again and quickly establish themselves to be untouchable. But as mentioned before, to push for change we require a clear vision of the future, not for our own benefit, but working towards something that will benefit future generations. It requires a certain level of selflessness and patience, which is especially hard to find nowadays. It's contradictory to the immediate needs and concerns we already face in a day-to-day life. The vast majority of people simply can't find the room for such patience and selflessness. So, with the flaws of the educational system so deeply entangled with the flaws of society itself, how could we possibly go about fixing or changing it? Maybe you have some better ideas. All I've managed to gain from this is that it's a nearly hopeless and futile situation to fight against. And that just made me tired. I guess what I'm trying to say in the end is that change-minded individuals need to have a realistic understanding of how slow and resistant systems can be. You can't create change on impulse and think it'll happen with the snap of a finger. For me, I don't find value in pushing for change that doesn't immediately benefit me. I'm not going to bother trying to create change that I can't witness myself. I doubt I'll ever have children either, so none of this really concerns me. But it's hard to imagine any of those things coming true when you can't even fix a lousy educational system. So don't be like me and go make a difference. Ultimately, this video is just a long and pitiful rant. I'm just some guy with no influence who's already given up on trying to move a nearly immovable object. I don't have any form of power that can contribute to change. In the end, I'm just pissed that I'm still suffering at the hands of the educational system. When will it fucking end? I've realized now that I don't want to die. I just don't want to live in a world like this one. All I really need is the ability to not be in a constant state of stress. I want to walk into some food place and just buy whatever without worrying about money. I don't want to turn into fucking Smeagol and go, "My precious," every time I pay the bills for something. Just let me live in peace until I die a meaningless death. Which probably won't happen since I'm still clinging to the system for survival. I don't really have the mentality or skills to make YouTube work out anyways. Also, you should be grateful that I dropped this disorganized mess after finals are done. But it's not like it matters. There's probably only like 10 people who actually watched the whole thing through. Actually, more like 1. Anyways, I'll see you later in 2025.